Right. So I believe all of you all have your teacher's guide, grade 13 teacher's guide. So the unit number is 10, unit 10, different constitutional models of government. So commonly we know this lesson as the 5 countries, because you are supposed to study about 5 countries. So although you say 5 countries, technically you are supposed to study 6 countries, because you are supposed to study the Sri Lankan system as well. Now I have covered the Sri Lankan power devolution method with pretty much all of you all, because we studied the 13th Amendment and the provincial council system. So if you guys have any questions, you all can unmute the mic and ask any questions, any clarifications. If you all have a doubt, just clarify that before going forward. Okay. Right. So basically, we're supposed to study the USA, India, Switzerland, Great Britain, Sri Lanka, and France. Now, we have studied the 4th unit, where we studied, depending on the power division mechanism, you can categorize the countries into 2 as unitary and federal. So we are studying 3 different countries for the federal format: USA, India, and Switzerland. And we are studying 3 unitary countries: Great Britain, Sri Lanka, and France. So the 3 federal countries we have are USA, India, Switzerland. Now these 3 countries have reasonably different federal formats. USA has a system that they allow regions to be really powerful. India has a system that they make the central government have the upper hand. And you have Switzerland, which is very much of a confederation that we studied under the fourth unit. That Switzerland is the closest example we have for confederations in the world at the moment. Then when it comes to unitary format, you guys know that there are 3 mechanisms to divide power within a unitary format without compromising the unitary nature, as deconcentration, decentralization, and devolution. Whereas Great Britain and Sri Lanka, we have applied devolution of power, and we are studying those 2. Other than that, we have a very centralized unitary format, which is France. Right. So let's take one by one. Let's study the American federal system, the American federal format. If you look at the teacher's guide, that when the lesson starts, as the federal model, following that you have this topic called the American system of government, right? Okay. So if you take a look at that note, the American system of government says, in the American federal system, the Constitution divides powers between the central and the state governments. An ordinary law enacted by the central government or by a state government cannot alter this fundamental law of the Constitution. Now, what does this mean? You guys know the difference between an ordinary law and a fundamental law. Fundamental law means when the law is included in the fundamental legal source of the country, which is the Constitution. Ordinary law means a general law which is passed in the legislature in their day-to-day activities. So the federal system in the US divides powers between the central government and the regions. Now in the USA, we call them states. In any federal system, you basically call them states. So it divides powers between these regional state governments. By the way, not to be confused with the ideal concept of state we normally talk about in political science. That means the sovereign state, the concept of state which is the core concept of political science. Here we call it regional states. The state of Texas, the state of Tamil Nadu, like that. Now, normally this confusion occurs when you are studying political science in English medium, because the sovereign state and the regional state both have the name state. If you are studying this in singular medium, the confusion is not there, because for the sovereign state you call it Rajya, for the regional state you call it Pranta. So Rajya, Pranta. So it doesn't confuse you in singular medium, but in English medium, both are called state. So make sure you are not confused there, right? So the constitution divides power between the central and state governments. Here, state governments means the regional governments. Okay, right. So if we recap what we studied under the fourth unit, we learned that one of the basic features about federal constitutions is that the power division between the central governments and the regional governments should be done through the constitution itself. If you guys remember that example I told you about, if someone gets, if I move into one of your places and I take a room from one of your places, right? Your fathers can either simply give me a key and say, this is your room, right? So the father is like the central government of that country. So when I move in, if I only got a key, he can take that key back whenever he wants. But he can give me that key after including the fact that I live there in that room in your deed, house deed, which means that from the fundamental source of authority of that house, it is mentioned, it is recognized that I am a part of your house, right? So this is the same system. In a unitary government, regional governmental bodies get power from ordinary law. Some law which is general law which is passed in the parliament. This is similar to just simply giving a key, saying this is your room. And in a federal system, it is necessary to give that power from the constitution itself. It is similar to including in the deed that this particular part belongs to this person for individual autonomy. Although the absolute owner is your father, that in that area I get like a reasonable amount of sovereignty for myself. That means the sovereignty of the house is shared. The same concept is applied here in a federal country, where in that region, the regional government has a reasonable sovereignty. Okay, right. So the very first feature is an obvious one, that in the USA, the powers are divided by using the fundamental law, and it cannot be altered by enacting an ordinary law. I mean, this is something very obvious, of course. The power division is including the constitution. Anything including the constitution, you can't change it with an ordinary law. If you really want to change it, what do you need? You need a constitutional amendment. So you need to amend the constitution in order to change this. Another thing we learned about federal countries is that these countries should have a rigid constitution. The constitutional amendment should require the approval of regions as well as the central government both. Otherwise, the central government has the capacity to sort of amend the constitution in their favor, right? So that's also that. It says, how does the constitution divide powers between the federal government? And within brackets, they say the federal government refers to the central government or the national government. In the USA, whenever you have the word federal in front, that refers to the central government. Federal government means the central government. Federal courts, that means the central government courts. Federal banks, central government banks. Federal reserves, central government reserves. That's why you have FBI agents, Federal Bureau of Investigations. Now, if you watch one of those American crime dramas, that you see, you have two people called local cops and the feds, right? Local cops means like the regional governments controlled police. Those are called the local cops. And then you have the FBI agents coming, the federal agents. That means those are the agents who are recruited, they're employed by the federal government, the central government. So that's why in these movies they show the local cops don't like when the feds come. So they are called feds because they are the agents of the federal government. Okay, right. So how does the constitution divide powers between the federal government and state governments? You have 4 sub-points under this. The American Constitution lists only the powers of the central or federal government. Powers of the state governments are powers that are not given to the federal government. Number 2, the national or federal government has powers enumerated in the Constitution. The federal government is the supreme authority in its sphere of powers. The powers of the state governments are not listed in the Constitution. The powers include those that are not enumerated for the federal government in the Constitution, and also the powers that are not prohibited in the constitutions of state governments. Some powers are prohibited for the federal as well as state governments in order to protect the federal spirit. Okay. Now, first 3 points are pretty straightforward. The fourth point is a little confusing, that you need to be a little clear with this one. Okay. So, you guys are aware of the Sri Lankan Provincial Council system, which we recently covered. That we are given powers, provincial council list, reserved list, and the concurrent list. That means first list says what the provincial council can do. Second list says that what the provincial councils can't do. Third list says what they mutually do. And if there are anything that are not mentioned in either of the lists, those powers go to the central government. Now, if we compare that with the American system, what does it say? The Constitution simply says the powers of the central government. That's it. Okay. I believe that you guys are taking notes when I'm explaining this. Huh? Right. So the US Constitution only mentions the powers of the central government. All remaining powers are given to the states. So they basically say the Constitution says these are the powers of the central government: national security, national taxation, foreign affairs, foreign investment, declaring war and peace, military, etc. They mention that. So if you compare that with the Sri Lankan Provincial Council system, think of a system where you only have the reserved list. It's something like that. Basically, it's just one list that comprises of all the powers of the central government, and that's it. That's literally it. All the other powers that are given to the regions, the state governments, right? So that's a basic idea of the first 3 points. Then the fourth point, some powers are prohibited for the federal as well as the state governments in order to protect the federal spirit. This is basically, there are certain powers which are only allowed to there are certain powers which are not allowed to either of the governments. There are certain things that are mentioned as that either of the governments should not do. That's in order to protect the federal spirit, right? This basically refers to any power that can sort of like damage the other government or attack the other government, right? That kind of things, like breaking away from the union or removing a state, things like that. Okay, right. Now you have general features of the American system of government. So what are the general features? Right. You have,